It has been a big few weeks of speculation and rumours running rampant when it comes to the royal family. Our social media feeds are flooded with various conspiracy theories on what has been going on with Princess Kate. But one rumour that was circulating was that King Charles had died, and at the front of who was spreading that was Kremlin approved media channels, prompting yet another example of Russian disinformation. Joining me now to discuss this is Bill Browder, head of the global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. Bill, thank you so much for your time today. Now, the British embassy in Ukraine were forced to deny that King Charles had died after Kremlin-approved media channels were publishing news that he had. What do you think the prerogative here is?
Well, basically, this is Russian disinformation. The Russians are constantly putting negative, false, misleading information out there to confuse, upset, troll everybody in the West, and the fact that they did it against King Charles is really a sort of a major sort of sign of disrespect, and I think that we should understand that this is what the Putin regime does.
Now, these reports from Russian media included deep-fake pictures of a Buckingham Palace official announcement and a picture of Charles in one. And this obviously comes at a time when Charles had announced that he does have cancer. And of course, many are doubting what is going on with Kate. Is it safe to say that Vladimir Putin's way of showing that he can flex his power wherever and whenever is by creating this spectacle online?
Well, this is what he does. He does this with elections. He does this with contentious issues. He wants to stir up trouble. He wants to distract. He wants to upset. And this is just his way of doing it. And he knows that there's no consequence. You know, we won't be able to trace it back to him. Um, there's no retaliation that we can actually do. It's not like we would retaliate on a symmetrical basis. And this is sort of, asymmetrical warfare, information warfare from his side.
Is this a common move for Vladimir Putin or the Kremlin in general to be pushing disinformation, especially at a time with various elections being held around the world?
Sure. I mean, remember that Putin was intimately involved in the in 2016 U.S. presidential election. You remember the whole Trump saying, show me Vladimir Putin, show me the emails. He was involved in trying to upset the French election of Emmanuel Macron. He leaked a whole bunch of embarrassing emails. He was involved in the Basque separatist movement. Many people believe that he was involved in promoting Brexit here in the UK. This is something that he does. It's not very expensive. It costs very little money, and it's something which, in a contentious situation where there's a lot of people on both sides of an argument, he might be able to tip the balance one way, whichever way he's trying to tip the balance.
Bill, over the weekend, Vladimir Putin secured another 6-year term as Russia's leader, and he won the election with 87% of the vote. For any election across the world, that is a large majority to win by. Does this make him the most popular leader of 2024?
No, I would say, first of all, that the 87% is a fraudulent number. I'm sure that they manipulated and stuffed the ballot boxes. If you look at the exit polls in places where people weren't in mortal danger of voting against Putin, in Belgrade, for example, Russians voted 3% for Putin. And the numbers were well below 50% in most other foreign countries where Russians were voting. Just think about this. This is a guy who murdered his most serious political opponent, Alexei Navalny, like a month ago. This is a guy who doesn't let any person even run for president without putting them in jail. This is a guy who controls all the media, so nobody can get in a word in edgewise. This is a guy who says that more than two people gathering in any place is a public demonstration and they'll be arrested. This is a guy who sent 400,000 young men to their deaths in Ukraine. He's not a popular leader. There's nothing popular about him whatsoever. This is a complete sham. It's a fabricated, fraudulent, fake election. And for anyone to say that he's popular is just ignoring all the facts that are in front of our face.
Is there anything free or fair about a Russian election that would demonstrate any ounce of living in a democratic state?
Well, all I know is that every single person who I know in who's in opposition to Putin is either dead, in jail, or in exile. There's no how can it be considered a free election if anyone anyone tries to run against him ends up dead or in jail? It just doesn't make any sense. It's not. There's nothing that's not an election. That's just a dictator putting on a show. And we shouldn't call it an election, and we shouldn't call him President Putin anymore. We should call him Mr. Putin, the person who has illegally taken over Russia and who has no legitimacy.
Well, he's obviously been trying to put on this facade that it is a normal democratic election. Russia even had ballot boxes and voting booths set up in Russian occupied areas of Ukraine. What do you think that says about the state of the war?
Well, Putin is trying to do whatever he can to legitimize the occupied territories of Ukraine and say that they're Russian territories, but they're not. Ukrainians, the still Ukrainian sovereign territory, and for him to put ballot boxes there is just again another sign of trying to thumb his nose at the West. There's no those votes are not votes that count. Those people are voting under duress, as are the rest of the people in Russia at the moment.
Now, we know that Vladimir Putin obviously has a following, especially within the Kremlin. But is there any reason to believe that there are groups working, under the cover of darkness to plot an assassination attempt?
Well, so if we look at it, so there were two main characters that tried to challenge Putin. Alexei Navalny, he was killed in a Siberian prison, and then Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, who was killed in a exploding plane crash. And Putin likes to rule by symbolism, and so by putting these two big symbols out there, he's sending a message to everybody else that if you try to challenge him, whether you try to overthrow him, you're going to die. And so most people don't want to die, and so they're not going to try to overthrow him. It's as simple as that.
Bill, going back for a while now, there has been rumours circulating that Putin hasn't been well. Have you heard anything about his health status as of late?
Well, there was a lot of what I would call wishful thinking about his health. A year or two ago, people were saying he doesn't look well, he's shaky, his face is puffed up, he's got some disease. But I think that's all it is wishful thinking. I think that he's the richest man in the world. He can afford the best health care there is, and if he's got any problems, they're being attended to. And he looks perfectly robust, and he certainly I don't see any signs that he's flagging on any fronts. And unfortunate for all of us, he's still there and probably will still be there for a long time to come, unless he fully missteps and ends up with a popular uprising.
Onto the state of the Russia-Ukraine war now. How important on a world scale is it that Russia does not win the war and that Putin is defeated?
Well, Putin has said very clearly, and so have all the people around him, that they're not stopping with Ukraine. So if they succeed in Ukraine, then the next stop is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And these are countries that are members of NATO. And if he then goes after these countries, then we're at war with Russia. The UK and the United States and Canada and other members of NATO. Or alternatively, we're not at war with Russia because we've then withdrawn from NATO, which means that he has free reign to sort of take over Europe. In either case, you end up with effectively, one way or another, we're sleepwalking into a world war. And so the only way to stop him is for us to give the Ukrainians the tools they need to fight back, and they're fighting very hard, and it's really really a grave tragedy that we're withholding financial aid to Ukraine at a time when they desperately need it, because if they don't get it, it's going to be 100 times more expensive for us to go directly to war with Russia.
Bill, do you think the reason why Putin orchestrated this invasion of Ukraine was in retaliation to NATO's joint efforts to quell Russia's breach of international law, especially starting in 2014 during the annexation of Crimea?
Well, in my opinion, this has nothing to do with NATO. Look, we've got two new members of NATO in the midst of this war, Sweden and Finland. I think this has to do much more with Putin's own internal politics. He's a guy who's been around for 24 years. He's a kleptocrat. He's stolen a lot of money. He's worried about the Russian people getting rid of him. He's worried about people overthrowing him. He's worried about popular uprisings. And the best way to have people not get mad at you as a dictator who's been around too long is to create a foreign enemy. And so I believe that this war is purely about distracting the Russian people, creating a foreign enemy so he can stay in power. And by the way, if he is not in power, he ends up going to jail, losing his money, and probably dying. And so for him, this is starting this war is really a survival strategy, a physical, personal survival strategy.
Just finally, Bill, we're now in the third year of war. How do you see this ending?
Well, what I know for sure is that Putin is totally dependent on this war at this point. He can't back down. And I also know that the Ukrainians can't allow Putin to succeed, because if he does, then look at what's happened in Bucha and other places where Russia has occupied territory. And so it all depends on who's got the superior resources to fight the war. And if we were to be more aggressive about sanctions, if we were to start to go after Russia's oil exports so they don't have the money that they currently have, that would help. And if we were more aggressive about giving Ukraine the long range missiles and other military aid that they're so desperately asking for, that could help. Um, but it's a very hard situation when both sides are so entrenched. And so the most likely scenario is that this war drags on and it drags on.
Bill Browder, thank you so much for your time today.